yeah, tonight is about composting, and John referred to it as black gold, but a lot of people refer to it as a garden gold. And if you're on here, you probably already know that. If not, you'll soon learn why we refer to as compost as garden gold. On the left-hand side, there is compost. It just kind of looks like soil, but it's organic matter. And on the right-hand side is a picture that one of my master gardeners shared with me, and Mike composts and has used compost for years in his garden, and that's the type of vegetables he grows and fruits. So I always, whenever I do a composting presentation, I've included this. A number of years ago, I was part of an extension leadership group called NELD, and we visited Costa Rica. And we each got to spend, groups of us got to spend an entire day on a farm. And we were with Eduardo. This is Eduardo. And one of the first things that Eduardo did was take us to his composting operation. And this is, you can see that beautiful compost there. And he's on the left-hand, that left-hand picture right there, he's growing coffee. That's what coffee looks like. But throughout our whole visit, I should have counted how many times Eduardo said, take care of your soil, take care of your soil. And he couldn't say enough about his compost and incorporating compost. So I think that's just a fun story to share. And he grew all kinds of fruits and vegetables, but bananas, coffee, a number of things. It was really interesting. Elizabeth, were you? I can't remember if you were with me on that one. Elizabeth was on that tour as well. You went to a different place. You probably got to see cacao chocolate.
No, I went to a coffee banana farm.
Mm-hmm. Well, Eduardo had some coffee and some bananas as well, but he had a lot of fruits and a lot of vegetables. Anyway, I'm going to give just a really brief mini soil lesson because that's what compost is kind of all about. But healthy soil equals good structure, and that equals good aggregation. So in the photo here, this is a soil with good structure. You can kind of see some clumps in there that's not clods, those hard clods that we don't like to get. Instead, it's aggregates or clumps of soil, and that is good. So soils with good structure are well drained, and anything you read about plants, it almost always says needs a well-drained soil, needs a well-drained soil. So soils with good structure are well drained, yet they hold water and nutrients. And I know that kind of sounds like an oxymoron a little bit, but think of a heavy clay, it's not well drained, versus a real sandy soil that doesn't hold water or nutrients well. So we kind of want that somewhere in between there. Soils with good structure also have adequate pore space, and that's just the spaces between everything that's in the soil, the air spaces, and that's where the roots grow. So roots do not grow in soil, they grow in pore spaces. And it's also for oxygen. And everybody knows how critical water is to plants, but a lot of people, I think, overlook how critical oxygen is to plants. And so if you have good pore space in your soil through good structure and aggregation, you're going to have better oxygen, larger quantities of oxygen, and that's better for root growth. So aggregates are groups of mineral particles, like the sand, silt, and clay, that are bound together. And they're bound together by fungal hyphae, earthworm secretions, and glues. We call these soil glues, and they come from beneficial fungi and bacteria. One of them is glomalin. I put that in there because I love saying that. I don't say it very often except in soil or composting presentations, but it's all these things that allow those mineral particles to hold together into aggregates. And that's what we need to have good soil. And all of this is highly dependent on organic matter, or example, compost, and then the biological activity in the soil. So what harms soil structure? This is my last slide, and then I'll get into composting. Well, low organic matter, and you want to have about at least 5% organic matter is something to aim for. And if you have a soil test taken, it will tell you the percentage of your organic matter. And it is something we need to add, yearly or at least every other year. Most people will do it on a yearly basis because it isn't, once you get to that 5% level, it won't stay there. It will, continue to decompose and disappear. Compaction harms soil structure because compaction compresses those pore spaces. It breaks down those aggregates, compresses those pore spaces, So it's hard for oxygen exchange, and it's hard for those roots to grow through. So we want to do everything we can to prevent it or relieve it. Unnecessary tillage. We've kind of gotten to be, not all of us, but some people tend to love to till their soil. Some people have those little rototillers that go between their rows when they're in their vegetable garden to do weed control. And that does definitely breaks down and harms structure. So avoid it or go no till if you can. Bare soil, we have soil erosion. You get the hard rains pounding on that soil that can cause compaction. So keep it covered either by planting or with mulch. You know, surface crusts, salts in soil, all of these things can harm soil structure. So in composting is the organic matter that, again, earlier I said soil structure is good aggregation, and that depends on organic matter. So some of our benefits of composting, other than garden gold, is it's a great way to recycle plant waste. We generate tons of plant waste. Grass clippings, if you don't mulch mow and just leave them on your lawn, which is perfectly fine and a great thing to do. But this time of the year with all the tree leaves, as we're pulling up the plant debris in our vegetable and annual flower gardens, cutting back perennials, we just generate a lot of plant waste. So composting, one benefit is it's a great way to recycle it and return the nutrients back to the soil. Decomposition takes place outside of the soil. Now, many of us will till the plants in our garden underneath. We'll till, if we use grass clippings as mulch, we'll till that in. We might till in grass leaves, and that is okay. But when the decomposition is taking place in the soil, next summer, what's not decomposed can take nitrogen away from the plants that are growing. Again, this is okay, but you have to tend to your nitrogen fertility then. Okay, so it is a benefit of composting outside of the garden. And as I said, it's garden gold. It's a great source of organic matter that's critical to healthy soils, improves that drainage in clay soils. It improves the water and nutrient holding in sandy soils. It promotes those many beneficial soil microorganisms we need, and it does provide nutrients. It slowly releases many nutrients back to the soil. It may not, unless you're putting on large amounts of compost, some vegetables and things like that need high nitrogen users, it may not provide all the nitrogen they need, but it does slowly release those nutrients. Most of the information I'm sharing with you tonight comes from this NEB guide, and in the chat box I did share the link, so you can click on that link and you'll get to it yet tonight, or you can just go to extensionpubs.unl.edu. Put garden compost in the search box and this will come up either as a PDF or you can read it online. And it's a good resource to have. Okay, so let's dive right in with the basics. You know where to compost. You can just compost just freestanding. You can just have a compost pile in the corner of your garden. It doesn't have to be in a fancy structure, but it can be. So these are examples of structures that are commonly used: the recycled pallets, a trash can with holes put into it for oxygen exchange, woven wire with hog panels or chicken wire inside of it. We see a lot of the 3-bin or 2 or 3-bin structures made out of bricks, or just built, some really nice ones built with pretty cedar wood and whatnot. It should be protected from wind because we don't want our compost piles to dry out too much. They need to stay moist. Partial sunlight is good because we also don't want them to dry out too much. And near a water source, but that's kind of up to you. You need to be maybe sprinkling it every now and then in dry periods like this summer. So that can be a convenience. There's many plans on the web if you want to look for plans to build some of these different ones, but they're pretty simple and they're pretty basic. One key thing, it's really up to you where you decide to compost or what type of bin or that you use, but the size is pretty critical. Excuse me. It needs to be large enough to hold heat. Okay, those microorganisms, if it's holding heat, it means the microorganisms are working to cause that decomposition. So as a rule, that 3 by 3 by 3 foot is the minimum size that you want. But it also needs to be small enough to allow oxygen into the center. Those microorganisms need oxygen to function, just like roots need it to grow. So the maximum we recommend is a 5 by 5 by 5. And I have this picture of the barrel here, and we see these every now and then, but you know, they're probably a little small, ideally, for what we recommend being the minimum size. They can work, they just may work a little more slowly. It's just a hint, it's great to have these open or removable sides because you're going to be doing a lot of you don't have to, but you should be doing a lot of turning of that compost. And it sure makes it a lot easier if we can remove the sides and not have to reach over into the top. It's a lot better on our backs. So just a hint there, that's a great thing to do. Or you can have it open like the brick ones here. Doesn't have to be enclosed completely. And you can have open bins. So probably one of the most common questions I get is, you know, what can I compost and what should I not compost? I had this later in my PowerPoint, and then I thought people might be asking it in the chat, so I would just get to it right away. So organic material, you know, almost all yard and garden waste, if it's plant debris, leaves, grass clippings, that's what we generate the most of at certain times of the year. Straw can be used, dead plants, weeds that have not gone to seed, ideally. Woody trimmings or wood chips. You want to shred or chip branches larger than 1/4 inch. They're very much slower to decompose, so it just helps to shred them and chip them if they're too large. Kitchen waste, so vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, eggshells themselves, not the eggs, but the eggshells are fine to put in a compost pile. Some other things are sawdust or even shredded newspaper or paper. Most newspapers, the ink is soy ink nowadays. There was a time where we had to worry about lead in our newspaper ink, but most of it's soy ink nowadays, so it's perfectly safe to do that. So these are some common things that can be used. What not to compost, it makes sense, but meat, eggs themselves, again, the eggshells are fine, but not the eggs themselves. Dairy, any kind of dairy, bones, any kind of oily, if you have a lot of oil-based dressing on a salad, then you may not want to put that in the compost pile. If you like to douse your salad with oil. Grease, lard, these can attract rodents or cause odors. Ideally, diseased plants, we just suggest not putting them in the compost pile. If the compost pile is managed and maintained to achieve a hot enough temperature, it can kill a lot of those pathogens, but that's a little bit of a risk. So just as a general rule of thumb, we recommend not putting diseased plants in. The same with the weeds that have gone to seed. Again, many of those seeds, if the temperature gets hot enough and you manage that compost pile ideally, then some of those seeds can be killed, but the chances of that, every speck of pathogen and every seed being killed is probably fairly low. So just play it safe. Weeds or grass treated with herbicide. Some of this depends on the herbicide that's been used, so it's really important to check the label. Some of the herbicides on the market will specifically state, do not, use these grass clippings, for anything as mulch in the garden or in the compost pile ever. So check that label. And if you're not sure, or you don't have the label, or you can't find it, it might be safe not to add it. Some of them are okay. Plants, grasses that spread by rhizomes. Again, the rhizomes might not be killed, and you might end up introducing something you don't want into one of your gardens or your lawn. A lot of people ask us about wood ash. Can I add the ash from my fireplace, from my wood burning stove? And ideally, no. We recommend not adding it. Wood ash is about 25% calcium carbonate, which is a liming material. It raises the pH of the compost, hence it's going to raise the pH of your soil. And because of that alkaline pH, it also decreases microbial activity. And in the Great Plains, our soils tend to be very high, not very high, but they tend to be on the alkaline side already in our landscape soils. So as a general rule, we do not want to be liming our soils or doing anything that will raise that pH further. Based on a soil test, usually we're wanting to lower it and add sulfur instead. So that's why we don't recommend wood ash, at least in the Great Plains. On the East Coast, it might be okay because they tend to have very acid soils and they are liming, but not here where we live. You don't want to add dog or pet manure because these can contain parasites. I honestly, if somebody wants to put in the chat box, hog manure might carry parasites as well that can go to humans, but I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on why hog manure is not supposed to be added. So if anybody knows for sure, put it in the chat box for me, please. Okay, so starting the compost pile, it's pretty simple. You want to collect organic material and some finished compost or topsoil. I'll explain each of these as I go along. Basically mix moist green and brown material, and I'll explain what I mean by that, along with some of that compost and soil. Moisten as needed. Turn the pile often if you can. Some people will choose to use passive or cool composting, and that can be done. It just takes a lot longer for it to compost or break down to get your garden gold. And keep those decomposition workers happy. I always tell people we're providing the ingredients. It's just like a baker. We're putting all the ingredients together, but it's the oven that does all the work of baking the cake for us. So it's the decomposition workers. If you keep them happy, you'll get quicker composting with fewer problems. So who are those decomposition workers? It's the microorganisms, aerobic bacteria. That's why we need oxygen in the pile, because they're the most efficient. Fungi, there's macroorganisms like the earthworms, millipedes. And a lot of these are introduced. That's why we add that topsoil or compost, because this is the way that we introduce these microorganisms that we need. You can buy commercial compost starters, but as a rule, if you just add your own topsoil, or if you're already composting and you just carry over some already finished compost, that will actually be better because it's going to be our native microorganisms that we need. Especially if you have compost that's already working, then you should have the good aerobic ones in there and so on. So topsoil and compost takes the place of commercial compost starters. That's why we add those. So how do you keep those workers happy? Use the correct ratio of green and brown organic material. Moisture, not too much. Your pile should feel about as moist as a squeezed out sponge. If you reach in there and you can squeeze it, you should only be able to get about 1 or 2 drops of moisture out of it. So in a really, the last 3 years, this year that we didn't have a problem, we probably had to add moisture to our compost piles. The last 3 years, we had fairly common rainfall. So you might want to have tarp nearby to cover your bin or your pile if we get into a really wet, rainy period. Because when it gets really wet and starts to get mucky and mud, down, it doesn't get the oxygen. You can start getting odors, and it doesn't build up the heat, and you're not going to get decomposition. And I've mentioned it more than once, but we need that oxygen. And you can do that by using different size organic material, turning that pile often. As we turn it, we're aerating it, we're adding oxygen to it. And then again, making sure that pile size is no larger than that 5 by 5 by 5. So what about, I keep talking about that carbon to nitrogen, green and brown material, brown and green material. So carbon is usually the dry brown. We tend to see it with leaves, dried leaves, straw, sawdust, paper, recycled paper. And nitrogen is provided by usually moist green material like grass clippings, green weeds, green leaves, etc. The microorganisms use the carbon for energy to kind of keep on eating is probably not the best analogy, but to keep on decomposing that organic material. And they use nitrogen for protein synthesis, but basically to help them grow and to reproduce. Now, all organic material has it's made up of both carbon and nitrogen. It's just some of them are higher in carbon than others. So in your compost pile, ideal would be 30:1 for the fastest decomposition. You may reach that, you may not ever reach that, but it's just good to know that that's kind of the ideal. And as I said, all organic material has some carbon and some nitrogen. So for example, brown tree leaves is 40:1. That's the ratio of carbon to nitrogen. Grass clippings are 20:1. So based on weight, you'd use half leaves to half clippings, and you'd get your 30:1 ratio. Now, we don't expect you to weigh everything. Very few people, I don't know of anybody that does that. So we'll give you a few other pointers on how to achieve that. If the pile is too high in carbon, it'll be cooler and that decomposition will be slower. If it's too high in nitrogen, think of grass clippings. If you just pile a whole bunch of grass clippings back in a corner, they get hot and they stink. So that's because there's too much nitrogen. So that's what can happen if you don't have that correct carbon to nitrogen ratio. Here, this is out of the NEB guide that I provided the link for you. So it just kind of gives you a hint. Here on the left-hand side is what we consider to be the high nitrogen materials. Okay, and they vary. You know, there is a range. There's not going to be one number or ratio that you can use all the time for everything. So a good example here is like grass clippings from a lawn that's maintained very low, hardly ever fertilized, if at all, fertilized once a year. You're going to have lower nitrogen, obviously, than one that is very highly maintained and maybe fertilized 2, 3, 4 times a year. So that's how the difference can be made. But this gives you an idea of the material you want to have, some of both. Probably in the summer months, we have a lot of grass clippings and a lot of other green weeds and things like that. So we have a lot of the high nitrogen or green materials. So it's some things that you can do if you have space, if you have a lot of storage space. You can bag up tree leaves and store them over the winter. Again, you need to have storage space to do this. Or you can get some shredded paper from your own, get a shredder and recycle your own paper to put in. That's another source to use. Straw, bale of straw. So if you have the opposite problem and you have too much carbon material and you don't have access in the fall, this time of the year, or once we stop mowing, we stop having green material, and you can add some nitrogen fertilizer or blood meal to provide that nitrogen that's needed. And I know in the NEB guide, it does give some examples of how much to use, especially if you're using straw or if you're using repaper. It's always a good idea to chop that organic matter. The smaller pieces are going to decompose faster. Now, some people do this. Some people have their compost pile, and as they're pulling stuff out, they just put it in a wheelbarrow, they can take it over and dump it in. You can do all those things, but just keep in mind that it's going to decompose that much more slowly. So by chopping the organic material, you get pieces of different sizes. Those smaller pieces decompose faster because there's more surface area for those microorganisms to work on to achieve that decomposition. Different sizes and textures will also improve drainage. So hopefully it doesn't get too wet, and it improves aeration to keep that oxygen in there. And you don't want to chop it too fine either. You know, don't chop grass clippings any more than they're already chopped. They're already chopped pretty fine. So you can use a lawnmower, you know, run over your leaves and with a bagger and collect it to chop up your leaves, shredders and chippers, pruners for your woody plant material. So building the pile from scratch. Ideally, we would start with this basic recipe, for example, to try to get that right mix of brown and green, at least to begin with. So as a general rule, if you have your high carbon material, about a 4 to 6 inch layer, about 6 inch, I go with about a 6 inch layer. It's a good idea if it's really dry before you're putting it in, then see if you slightly moisten it as you go, or slightly moisten it before you add it to the compost pile. And then on top of that, you'd add a layer 3 to 4 inches, maybe 3 of high nitrogen material. Again, slightly moistened if needed. The green material is usually pretty moist to begin with. It's the carbon material that might need to be moistened because that can be very dry. And then you'd spread on about a 1 inch layer of soil or compost, whichever one you're using, and mix those 3 layers together. And then you'll just kind of keep repeating these layers as you have organic material. And once you get to the minimum size, you're going to start getting that heat buildup and you're going to start getting that decomposition. And usually once we initially start doing this, then after a while, we just kind of add, most people just kind of add it as they have it, but it's important to keep that carbon nitrogen ratio, that you're not putting too much carbon, you're not putting too much nitrogen in. Pile temperature, it should begin to heat up in a few days once you've reached that adequate size, minimum size. That heat's generated from microorganisms actually oxidizing the carbon. And 90 to probably 140, I have 150 on there, but 90 to 140, 150 is probably the range you're going to find, and it's an ideal range to stay within. The warmer it is, the hotter it is, the faster you're going to get decomposition. So usually the pile, if you have a thermometer, it's a great idea to have a thermometer so you can be checking it if you want to do that active composting or a little bit quicker composting. So usually what will happen is the pile will heat up, especially in the center, and then it'll start to go down again. And that's usually when you need to turn it. But as a general rule, you're turning about once a week. Some will heat up even faster, and you could turn it even more and you would have compost quicker. You need around 140 to 150 is what's needed to kill diseases and weed seeds. And all the pathogens and all those weed seeds have to be exposed to those temperatures, and those temperatures are going to be in the center of the pile. They're not going to be on the edge of the pile, the top of the pile. If you achieve those temperatures, it's going to be in the center of the pile. So all the pathogens all that undecomposed material has to be turned into that center and be there for a period of time long enough to actually kill those pathogens and weed seeds. And that's, you can understand where that maybe isn't as easy to achieve as one might think. So that's why we tend to lean towards just leave the disease material and weed seeds out. If it gets too hot, if it's 160 degrees Fahrenheit or hotter, it's going to kill the workers. And it's going to dry out that pile. If it's too cool, the pile will decompose that much more slowly. So the turning is to incorporate the oxygen. We refer to this as active or hot composting. And some people choose to do passive composting. It just can take you up to 2 years before you'll get your garden gold. If you do the cool composting and you don't do the turning or the chopping or some of the things that I'm talking about tonight. That introduces those oxygen, like I said earlier. It moves the undecomposed material to the center, so it's exposed to the microorganisms, the heat. Once a week is ideal. You could do it a little more often. You can do it less often, again, but it'll be slower decomposition. When you're turning, that's the time to check it. Make sure it's moist, feels like a squeezed out sponge. And a watering can is a great way to slightly moisten it and not overdo it. So once the compost is in, you can see here as it's being spread, it basically looks like black gold, like John described it. It looks like good garden soil, but it is organic matter. So it can be used as a soil amendment. Vegetable gardens, flower gardens, spread it on the surface, and incorporate it 6 to 8 to 9, 12 inches deep. You don't need to go any deeper than that because not many roots grow much deeper than that. But that's probably the ideal way to use it. But you can also spread it on the surface and just let nature do its job. Let freezing and thawing of the soil over the winter, let the earthworms kind of mix it in. It's going to take it longer to mix it in. But if you're using a no-till operation, that's perfectly fine to do and not till it in. It can be used as mulch or a top dressing around vegetables and flower gardens. If you have landscape beds, perennial flowers, shrub borders, you can do about a 1-inch layer on the soil surface, maybe a little more. You don't want to overdo it. Lawns, you can use it on established lawns. You can core aerate, spread the compost on the lawn, and then kind of rake it to work it down into some of those aeration holes. And then let nature, let the earthworms and whatever mix it throughout the soil. So, because it's not going to get incorporated thoroughly. And the more thoroughly it can be incorporated, actually, the more beneficial that is. But they are finding that it's fine to, like I said, spread it on the surface, let nature do the jobs, core aerate, spread the compost and rake it in. It's a good way to add that organic matter to your soil. It can be used in potting mixes, either for raised beds or for our containers. And this is from our NEB guide. So it is in the NEB guide if you don't want to write this down. But you can, ideally, you'd mix it with peat moss or shredded bark, sand, a really loamy topsoil. And the recommendation is about a 10% of it minimum compost and a 50% maximum. So how much compost to use? Rule of thumb, Spread compost no deeper than about the third of the depth you're planning to till it into the soil or work it into the soil. And if you're just going to use it as mulch or just a top dressing on top, you probably use a little bit less. So if you're going to amend the soil 6 to 9 inches deep, you'd use a 2 to 3 inch layer of compost and then till it in. There's online calculators. You can just Google an online compost calculator and you put in the square footage of the area that you're going to add compost to, and you put on the depth, and it will tell you how much you need. But as a general rule, 1 cubic yard of compost will cover about 108 square feet at a 3 inch depth, 216 at a 2 inch depth, and about 324 square feet at a 1 inch depth. And I'm part of our church, the church I belong to, just put in a huge new addition, raised the parking lot. I'm not exaggerating, 10, 12 feet. We now have steps from the sidewalk to get up to the parking lot. And we have a lot of planting areas, and it was, as you can imagine, compacted, icky clay. And I talked them into getting some great compost, and I think it's going to make a big difference. I hope anyway. The soil was pretty bad to begin with. We brought in topsoil and we brought in compost. Diagnosing compost problems. Okay, so these are some complaints we'll hear every now and then from people. If it smells like rotten eggs, which your neighbors, if you're in town, your neighbors aren't going to like you. If your compost smells like rotten eggs, you won't like it. But that's a sign of low oxygen. And again, that oxygen is so important because, as I mentioned earlier, it's anaerobic bacteria that are the best workers. They're the best decomposers. So we want to, if you have low oxygen, then there's going to be more of the anaerobic bacteria. They'll cause decomposition, but it'll be slower, and then they can actually create odors as well. So if it's too wet or it's compacted, it needs to be turned. Maybe you've used mostly grass clippings, and that gets very matted down and compacted. And that can lead to a rotten egg odor. Ammonia odor is usually too much of the nitrogen material and not enough carbon. Low pile temperature, pile too small, too dry. Again, low oxygen, lack of nitrogen, just cold weather over the winter. You know somebody's composting correctly when you see the steam coming off their compost pile in the wintertime. So high pile temperature, the pile's too large. No ventilation around the pile. Those can be some causes. And again, if you've got animals like raccoons or rats invading, maybe some meat or some fatty food was used. And I think that wraps up my presentation.